Hello and welcome, students, to Swadharma IS Academy.
Hello, sir.
I am your lead faculty for International Relations and Economy, and today we are taking up a topic that is, well, it's not just current affairs, it's a structural shift in India's foreign economic policy.
Something fundamental.
Precisely. So this is going to be a very comprehensive session. I urge you to have your notebooks ready. But before we begin, our mandatory reminder.
Of course.
Watch till the end for complete conceptual clarity, and please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Swadharma IAS Academy. It really helps the channel.
Thank you, sir. As a senior aspirant, I've been following the news around the Republic Day parade very closely.
Yes.
And the headlines are they're dominated by this new agreement. I'm here today, hopefully, to ask the questions that confuse us, the things that stop us from translating those headlines into solid mains answers.
Excellent. That is exactly the right approach. We are, of course, discussing the landmark conclusion of the India-European Union Free Trade Agreement, the FTA.
The one announced on Republic Day.
The very same. Officially announced with EU leaders right there, present at the parade on January 26, 2026. Now, for those of you preparing for the civil services, you need to understand the gravity of this.
That's not just another MOU.
Far from it. We see MOUs signed every other week. You read about them in the papers. This isn't that. This is, well, it's on a completely different scale, which is why both Prime Minister Modi and the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen have actually termed this the mother of all deals.
Sir, if I can just jump in right there. That tagline.
Please.
Mother of all deals. I mean, it sounds a little bit like, diplomatic marketing hype, a good headline.
I understand the skepticism. It's healthy.
But when we're sitting in the exam hall, we can't just write a phrase like that without backing it up. So from let's say a GS Paper 2 perspective on bilateral agreement or GS Paper 3 on the economy, does it really support such a strong claim? Or is it just pleasantries?
That is the skepticism I expect from every serious aspirant. And the answer is no, it is not hype. It is, in fact, a reflection of the sheer scale and the regulatory depth of this agreement.
Okay.
Let's look at the hard data to justify that title, so you can use this in your answers. We are talking about a deal that covers a combined population of 2 billion people.
2 billion. That's India and the 27 EU nations combined.
Correct. Now, if you aggregate the GDP of India and the European Union, you are looking at roughly 25% of the global GDP.
A quarter of the world's economy.
A quarter of the world's economy, exactly. This is a massive part of the world's economy deciding to integrate. In terms of global trade, this combined bloc represents about 30% of all goods and services traded on the planet.
But, sir, trade volume is the real indicator, isn't it? I mean, we trade a lot with China, but that is a deeply problematic relationship because of the massive trade deficit we run. How does the EU compare?
And that is the crucial distinction. That's the point you must highlight. The EU is already India's largest trading partner in goods if you treat the 27 member states as a single bloc.
Right, as a single entity.
Yeah, as a single entity. The trade volume just crossed $190 billion in the fiscal year 2025. But, and here's a key difference with China, or even the U.S.
The balance.
The balance, precisely. Unlike our relationship with China, where we have a crippling deficit, or with the U.S., where we have a surplus, but we face constant policy friction, tariffs, GSP withdrawal.
A lot of unpredictability.
A lot of unpredictability. The EU relationship is, by contrast, balanced and profitable. India actually runs a trade surplus with the European Union of approximately 15 to 25 billion.
So we're already in a good position, and this FTA builds on that.
Exactly. The explicit goal of this free trade agreement is to double that trade volume, that $190 billion figure, by the year 2032.
Double it in just 6 years.
That's the ambition. So when we analyze this for GS Paper 2, we are looking at the consolidation of a partnership with a major, stable, democratic global pole. And for GS Paper 3, we are moving from a simple transactional relationship, buying and selling, to a much deeper structural integration of our economies.
Structural integration. That's a very strong keyword. I'm noting that down for a conclusion. But, sir, before we dive into the specific provisions, the nitty-gritty of the deal, the goods, the services,
yes,
I think it would be really beneficial if we established a timeline, a bit of historical context.
A very good idea.
This hasn't just happened overnight. I recall reading in my basic materials that negotiations actually began way back in 2007. So Why the long delay? What happened?
A very relevant question for the context part of your main's introduction. And the history here is also excellent fodder for prelims chronology questions. So pay attention to the dates.
Okay.
The Broad-Based Trade and Investment Agreement, or BTIA, that was the original name for this FTA.
Yeah, right.
Negotiations for the BTIA started in 2007. They went on for several years, round after round. However, the talks completely stalled in 2013. We went into a deep freeze for almost a decade.
And if I recall correctly, sir, the sticking points back then, they were quite similar to the challenges we still hear about today, weren't they?
They were.
Things like data protection, the high tariffs on European alcohol and spirits, and of course the automobile sector.
Precisely. You've hit on the three main roadblocks. The disagreements in 2013 were sharp, and at the time, they seemed unbridgeable. The EU's offensive interests, as they call them, were focused on getting deep cuts in our auto tariffs and wine duties.
That's what they wanted from us.
Yes. They also had major issues with our data protection standards. India was not considered data secure by their GDPR standards, which was a huge barrier for services trade.
And on our side, what were our red lines?
On the other side, India was extremely defensive. Our primary concern was protecting our dairy and agricultural sectors. We were, frankly, in a more protectionist mindset back then. So for nearly a decade, there was a complete deadlock. The negotiations only resumed in earnest in 2022.
Sir, I'd like to interject with a query that often comes up in answer writing. It's the why now factor.
It's the trigger.
Exactly. Why did it take nearly 20 years to close this gap? What changed in the geopolitical landscape between 2013 and 2026 that compelled both sides to finally come to the table and finalize this now?
That is the crux of the geopolitical angle, and you must explain this in your answer to show the examiner you understand the bigger picture. The world in 2026 is vastly different from 2013.
Completely.
Two major global factors drove this acceleration. First, the conflict in Ukraine and the subsequent energy crisis it created in Europe. That fundamentally changed Brussels' calculus. Europe suddenly realized it had become dangerously overdependent on Russia for energy. And at the same time, the pandemic had shown them they were dangerously overdependent on China for their supply chains.
So they needed to diversify.
Urgently.
Urgently. They needed a de-risking strategy. They needed reliable partners.
And India fits that role.
Perfectly. India offers scale, a democratic framework, a reliable legal system, and a massive growing market. We became the obvious alternative.
Okay, so that's the European motivation. What about ours?
The second factor, and this is perhaps more important from India's perspective, is the global China plus one strategy. And as you mentioned earlier, the rising unpredictability of the United States.
Right.
With global supply chains being, well, frankly, being weaponized. Both India and the EU realized they needed a stable, democratic partner for the long haul. The EU needs a reliable alternative to China for manufacturing. India needs high-end technology and capital, which the EU possesses in abundance.
So it's convergence of strategic necessity. That's the perfect phrase. It moved beyond mere commercial interest into the realm of strategic necessity.
It's interesting you mentioned the U.S. unpredictability. We've seen it firsthand, haven't we? The tariffs on our steel and aluminum, the withdrawal of GSP benefits, the sanctions on countries like Venezuela and Iran that affect our energy interests.
We have.
It really seems this deal is also a major exercise in India's strategic autonomy.
Absolutely. You should mark that term down and use it. Strategic autonomy. We will discuss the U.S. factor in more detail later, but you are absolutely right. Diversification is the key. India simply cannot afford to rely solely on the U.S. market as our primary engine of growth. It's too risky.
It makes us vulnerable.
Very. Now let's move to the structure of the deal itself. This is where the technical details come in and where you will find your points for the body of your answer. The whole deal is built on a very important concept. It's called asymmetric liberalization.
Could you unpack that phrase, asymmetric liberalization, for the benefit of fresh aspirants? It sounds. Well, it implies an unequal arrangement, which might sound negative, but in trade parlance, it usually favors the developing nation, correct?
That is correct. Your understanding is spot on. In a standard FTA between two equals, let's say the U.S. and Canada, you might see a 1.1 cut. You cut tariffs today, I cut tariffs today. Symmetrical.
A level playing field from the start.
Yes, but here there is asymmetry, and it is deliberately designed to favor India. The EU, the more developed partner, has committed to the immediate removal of tariffs on 99.5% of Indian goods.
99.5%.
Immediately.
Immediately. From day one of the implementation of this agreement, almost everything India exports to the EU, from textiles to engineering goods, goes in duty-free.
And India's obligation in return.
India's commitment is the removal or reduction of tariffs on over 90% of EU goods. But, and this is the absolute key to the deal, it is phased over a period of 5 to 10 years.
So we have a grace period.
We have a very generous grace period. This phase-in period is designed to allow our domestic Indian industries, our MSMEs, time to adjust to the competition, time to upgrade. We have effectively bought a decade of time for our industries to prepare while getting immediate, unfettered access to their market.
That sounds like a massive tactical win for our export sector. It really does.
It is.
Let's break down India's gains first then. In GS Paper 3, we often discuss the need to boost labor-intensive manufacturing, to solve the unemployment issue, the jobless growth phenomenon. How does this FTA address that specific problem?
That is probably the most significant aspect of this deal for our domestic economy and for employment generation. Let's look at the sectors like textiles, leather, and footwear.
The big employers.
Exactly. These are high labor intensity sectors. They employ millions of people, particularly women. This is where our demographic dividend is either realized or squandered.
Right.
Until now, Indian exports in these categories faced a duty in Europe of anywhere between 8% to 12%. It was a significant cost.
And meanwhile, our direct competitors like Bangladesh and Vietnam.
Precisely. This is where we were losing the game. Bangladesh, because of its least developed country, or LDC status, accesses the European market at 0% duty.
They have duty-free access.
Vietnam signed its own FTA with the EU a few years ago, so they also access it at 0%. India was the only major textile player paying a 10% duty on average.
Which made our products uncompetitive on price from the get-go.
Regardless of quality, a shirt from Tirupur was 10% more expensive than one from Dhaka, simply because of the tariff. With this new deal, Indian textiles, leather goods, footwear, they all enter the EU at 0% duty immediately.
It levels the playing field completely.
It does more than that. It gives us an edge because of our quality and scale. We are expecting a massive boost for MSMEs and employment generation in manufacturing clusters like Tirupur, Kanpur, Agra, and Ludhiana.
So that effectively neutralizes the tariff disadvantage we've been fighting against for a decade.
Completely.
What about other industrial goods? I'm thinking about, higher value-added sectors.
The benefits extend there as well. Take jewelry and gems, a big export for us from places like Surat. The duty there drops from roughly 3–4% down to 0%.
Significant for margins in that industry.
Very. Then you have pharmaceuticals, which is a knowledge-intensive sector and one of our global strengths. We have secured easier market access for our generic drugs. And crucially, the EU has agreed in the text not to block Indian generics through so-called patent linkage issues.
Could you explain that? What's patent linkage?
It's a procedural hurdle. Essentially, it would mean our drug regulators would have to check for existing patents before approving a generic. The EU was pushing for this, but it would have delayed our generics from entering the market. We fought that off.
So our generic industry is protected.
Yes. Another major fear was that they would use patent disputes to stop our consignments at the port, custom seizures. We have secured clear language that prevents that from happening.
That's a huge relief for the pharma sector.
It is. Also, we can't forget marine products. Think of the massive prawn and shrimp exports from Andhra Pradesh and the coastal states. They will also see significant duty reductions, boosting the aquaculture industry.
Okay, so that's the offensive side, our gains. Now let's move to the other side of the ledger. What did India give away?
Fair question.
The inquisitive Asper in me knows that the EU wouldn't sign a deal of this magnitude without getting significant concessions. The controversial sectors, as you mentioned, have always been European, cars, and wines. How we handled that without hurting our domestic players?
You are right to focus on that. This is where the giveaways are, but I would argue they are very calculated and segmented, not a blanket opening up. Let's start with automobiles.
The headline grabber.
Absolutely. Currently, as you know, India imposes a massive tariff on imported cars. It ranges from 60% to over 100%, sometimes reaching 110% with all cesses. It is essentially a prohibitive wall.
Meant to foster our own auto industry.
Exactly. Under this deal, that tariff will come down to 10% over a period of 5 to 10 years.
From 110% to 10%. Sir, purely from a domestic industry protection standpoint, that sounds drastic. Won't that destroy our domestic auto industry? If a BMW or an Audi suddenly becomes cheap, what happens to Tata and Mahindra? Won't this just flood the market with European cars?
That is a very common fear, and it's a valid concern. But the government has negotiated a very important safety valve. It's called a quota system, or more technically, a TRQ, a tariff rate quota.
The quota, so it's not unlimited.
It is not unlimited. This reduced 10% tariff does not apply to every car. It applies only to a specific number of vehicles per year. We are allowing 250,000 vehicles to enter under this reduced tariff regime.
250,000 vehicles.
Yes. And to give you some context for that number, in the recent India-UK FTA discussions, the cap being talked about was around 37,000.
So this is much, much larger.
It is a huge number, I agree. But let's break down the composition of that quota and, more importantly, the market segmentation. This is where the strategy lies. Out of those 250,000 vehicles, 160,000 are ICE internal combustion engine cars. The remaining 90,000 are EVs, electric vehicles.
Right.
Now think about the impact. This will primarily be felt in the luxury car segment. A BMW or an Audi that currently costs, say, 80 lakhs might see its price come down by 20, 30 lakhs. It becomes more accessible to the upper middle class.
But what about the mass market?
That's the key. The mass market cars, your Maruttis, your Tatas, your Hyundais, they operate in a price bracket, say, sub 15 lakhs, where the EU manufacturers simply do not compete. Volkswagen or Mercedes-Benz does not make a low-cost small car for the Indian mass market.
So their products don't directly threaten a Tata Nexon or Maruti Swift?
Not at all. The domestic industry that protects the common man's car is safe. It is the luxury segment that will see more competition, which arguably could be good for the consumer.
I see. So it's a defense based on market segmentation. And what about the EV quota, 90,000 units? Is that a threat to our budding domestic EV ecosystem? We're trying to push companies like Tata EV, Ola Electric, and other startups.
It acts as both a challenge and a catalyst. It's a double-edged sword. On one hand, yes, it introduces competition, but on the other, it forces our domestic manufacturers to upgrade their technology faster.
And we have a timeline for that.
We do. The tariff reduction on EVs is phased over the longest period, 10 years. This gives our domestic industry a full decade to mature, backed by the government's PLI scheme for batteries and EVs. The government's calculation is simple. If our EV sector cannot stand on its own 2 feet after 10 years of protection plus PLI incentives, then indefinite protectionism is not the answer.
Fair point. It's a deadline for becoming competitive.
Exactly.
Now let's look at the other sensitive sector, alcohol, specifically wines and spirits. This always seems to be a major talking point for the EU in every trade negotiation they have.
Indeed. And for good reason, they are major producers. Here, too, the tariffs are slashed significantly. From the current 150%, they will come down to a range of 20-30% for wines and around 40% for spirits and beer.
Again, that sounds like a huge drop. Is this also subject to a quota?
Yes, this is also quota-based. We are not allowing an unlimited flood of cheap European wine. The strategic idea here is not just about individual consumption. It's about promoting the tourism and hospitality sectors.
How does that connect?
Well, you cannot build a world-class tourism industry if premium amenities are taxed at 150%. This move makes premium, high-quality liquor more affordable for hotels, high-end restaurants, and bars. It improves the ecosystem for tourism without flooding the mass market where our domestic whiskey producers operate.
So again, segmentation. Premium versus mass market.
Precisely.
Sir, there's one more sector I noticed in the source material which seemed quite interesting. Aerospace. This feels less like a commercial concession and more like a strategic gain.
Yes, this is a very shrewd piece of negotiation. This is a game changer. We have agreed to bring tariffs down to 0 on aircraft engines, all spare parts, and critical maintenance equipment.
This directly links to the global rivalry between Airbus and Boeing, doesn't it?
It does. Boeing is American. Airbus is European. By removing tariffs on Airbus engines and parts, we are effectively incentivizing our rapidly growing Indian Airlines Indigo, Air India, Akasa to favor Airbus aircraft in their future orders.
So it's a strategic tilt towards Europe in aviation.
It is. But the primary strategic angle for India is that it massively boosts our own MRO sector. That's maintenance, repair, and overhaul.
The dream of making India an MRO hub.
Exactly. Currently, our airlines fly their planes to Singapore, Dubai, or even Sri Lanka for major repairs and engine overhauls. We lose billions in foreign exchange. We want that business to happen here in India. By making parts cheaper, we make setting up MRO facilities in India more viable. This aligns perfectly with Make in India in the defense and aerospace manufacturing sectors.
That is a brilliant connection. It really shows how a well-negotiated trade policy can directly drive a specific industrial policy objective.
Yes.
Let's shift gears now to Section 3 of our discussion, services, investment, and mobility. We often focus so much on goods and tariffs, but India is fundamentally a services powerhouse.
Correct, and that is reflected in our trade balance. As I mentioned, we have a surplus with the EU, and a large part of that comes from our services exports. The deal grants Indian service providers access to 144 service subsectors in the EU.
And what does that include?
It includes our strengths, IT and IT-enabled services, of course, but also engineering, consultancy, accounting, financial services, and even healthcare services like medical transcription and remote diagnostics. This is where our demographic dividend comes into play. We have the young, skilled workforce. Europe has an aging population. They need our services. They need our people.
On the topic of people and the workforce, there's often confusion in the exam hall regarding the term mobility. Students sometimes confuse it with immigration. Could you please clarify this distinction for us? Does this deal mean open borders for Indians to go to Europe?
No, that is a critical distinction, and I'm glad you raised it. It absolutely does not mean open borders. Immigration implies a path to citizenship or permanent residency, like getting a green card in the U.S. or an EU passport. That is not what this is about. Mobility, in this context, refers to the temporary, regulated movement of professionals for work or students for education. The pact provides for what is being called uncapped mobility for certain specific categories.
What does uncapped mean in this context? No limit.
It means there is no numerical limit or quota on the number of visas that can be issued for these specific categories. For example, Indian students who want to go and study in the EU, there will be no cap on the number of student visas. This contrasts sharply with the visa caps and lotteries we often see with the US or the UK.
That's a huge benefit for students. And for professionals.
For professionals, it means easier movement for our IT workers, for researchers, scientists, and other skilled labor. But a crucial part of this, perhaps the most important part, is the provision for mutual recognition of qualifications.
This has been a major barrier for years.
A huge barrier. In the past, an Indian architect or a chartered accountant or a doctor couldn't just go and practice easily in Europe because their Indian degree wasn't automatically recognized. This deal creates a formal framework to solve that problem, profession by profession.
That opens up a massive market for our skilled professionals.
An entire continent.
I also read something about a totalization agreement regarding Social Security. This is a grievance I hear often from friends in the IT sector who work in the U.S. They pay Social Security there but never get the benefits if they come back. How does the EU deal handle this?
This is a vital financial win for our professionals and companies. Under this deal, we have what is called a totalization arrangement. Let me explain the mechanism.
Please.
Currently, if an Indian professional works in, say, France for 3 or 4 years on a temporary visa, they are forced to pay very high Social Security taxes from their salary. When they return to India, that money is lost. It's a sunk cost because they didn't stay long enough to be eligible for a French pension.
So it's a direct financial loss.
A huge one. With this new agreement, Indians working in the EU on temporary visas will not have to pay into those Social Security schemes if they can prove they are already contributing to a scheme like the EPF back in India. Or if they do pay, there will be a mechanism to either withdraw that amount upon returning or transfer it to their Indian pension account.
So no more double payments or lost savings.
It prevents the loss of these national insurance contributions, which will save Indian companies and their employees millions upon millions of dollars every year.
That's a tangible benefit.
Yeah.
Now, moving to investment protection, I understand there is a new dispute resolution system being set up.
Yes. You see, to encourage large-scale EU capital inflow, and remember, we need that investment for our infrastructure, for our manufacturing, we have established a modern, time-bound dispute resolution system.
Why was this needed?
EU investors wanted certainty. They wanted to know that if they invest billions in an Indian project and a dispute arises, they won't get stuck in our judicial delays for 20 or 30 years. This new mechanism provides that assurance. It replaces the old bilateral investment treaties, the BITs, most of which had lapsed.
Okay, so let's widen the aperture now to the strategic and geopolitical dimensions. This is absolutely essential for a high-scoring GS Paper 2 analysis. We touched upon the China+1 strategy earlier. How should we frame this in a man's answer?
You should frame it as a shift from a transactional relationship to a structural integration of economies. It is moving far beyond a simple buyer-seller relationship.
Okay.
The EU, as we discussed, has had a rude awakening. It realized it overdepended on Russia for energy and on China for manufactured goods. They are now actively de-risking their economy. And for India, we need technology transfer, we need high-quality capital, and we need reliable markets. The analogy I often use is that we are building a second engine for our economic growth. We can't be flying on just the American engine anymore.
Too turbulent.
Too turbulent and unpredictable. The EU engine is perhaps slower, more bureaucratic, but it is stable and reliable.
Speaking of the American engine, the U.S. factor, you called it the elephant in the room. How does the timing of this deal relate to the political climate in the U.S.? I mean, specifically with the legacy of Donald Trump's policies or the general protectionist trend we see there.
The timing is absolutely not a coincidence. The U.S. has become increasingly inward-looking and, frankly, protectionist. We have seen the arbitrary withdrawal of GSP benefits, which hurt many of our smaller exporters. We have seen tariffs slapped on our steel and aluminum. We have seen sanctions on third countries that impact our energy security.
There's no predictability.
None. And this unpredictability makes the EU deal vital for India's strategic autonomy. We cannot have our entire export sector held hostage to the political whims of Washington, D.C. The EU, despite its complex bureaucracy, offers a rules-based, stable partnership that we can rely on for the next 20 years.
It creates a hedge, a strategic counterweight.
Exactly. It is a strategic hedge. And furthermore, the partnership extends beyond just trade. There are clauses on collaboration on green hydrogen, on clean energy, on defense technology. The EU is also now more vocally supporting India's aspirations for a permanent seat at the UN Security Council and our initiatives at the G20. It creates a complete diplomatic support structure.
Now, sir, a critical analysis is incomplete without looking at the negatives, or at least the challenges. We cannot write a balanced mains answer without a dedicated issues and challenges section.
Very true.
So let's discuss Section 5, the critical challenges and concerns, the so-called negative list. I noticed from the reports that dairy and agriculture are largely excluded from our tariff cuts.
Yes, this was India's red line from day one of the resumed negotiations. We have not offered any tariff cuts on EU dairy products, milk, cheese, yogurt, or on their primary agricultural products like wheat and rice.
Why was the government so adamant on this particular point? Especially considering we gave significant ground on something as big as autos.
It is a socioeconomic imperative. You must understand the fundamental structural difference between their industry and ours.
Please explain.
Indian dairy is not an industry in the European sense. It is characterized by millions and millions of small, marginal farmers, many of them women, with maybe 2 or 3 cattle. They are organized into cooperatives like Amul. It is a livelihood issue for the rural poor.
Right.
European dairy, on the other hand, is industrial. It's highly mechanized, with massive factory farms, and it is heavily subsidized by their common agricultural policy, the CAP. If we open the floodgates, subsidized European milk powder and cheese would wipe out the livelihoods of our marginal farmers overnight. It was politically and socially impossible to open this sector.
And in the spirit of reciprocity, I assume the EU also protected its own sensitive agricultural sectors.
Correct. We must always mention that. This wasn't a one-way street. The EU has maintained its own protections on its beef, sugar, and certain rice sectors where they feared competition. So both sides agreed to keep their most sensitive agricultural sectors off the table.
Okay, that makes sense. Now coming to a more complex area. The non-tariff barriers, or NTBs, this is often where the real game is played in modern trade, isn't it?
It is. Tariffs are the old game. NTBs are the new one.
The biggest concern here seems to be something called CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It sounds very complicated. Could you please explain what this is and how the deal handles it?
CBAM is, in simple terms, a carbon tax on imports. The EU's logic is this. We have very strict green laws for our domestic industries. Our steel plants have to be clean. If you produce steel or aluminum in a dirty, high-carbon way in your country, we will impose a tax on it when it enters Europe. This is to level the playing field for our green manufacturers.
So it's a tax based on the carbon footprint of the product.
Precisely. And this was a major threat to Indian exporters of steel, aluminum, and cement, as our production is still largely coal-intensive. This CBAM tax could completely erode or even reverse the benefits of the tariff reductions we just talked about.
It would make our steel expensive again, but for a different reason. So how did we fix this in the deal? Did we get a full exemption from CBAM?
We did not get a complete waiver. The EU is very rigid on its environmental goals, and they see CBAM as central to their climate policy. But we secured a very clever legal clause.
And what does it do?
It effectively grants India an MFN status on carbon tax. MFN means most favored nation. The clause states that if the EU, in the future, grants a CBAM exemption or a reduction to any other country, let's say they cut a deal with the United States or China, India automatically gets the exact same treatment.
So we piggybacked on any future concessions they might give to a bigger player.
We did. It's a defensive clause that ensures we are not discriminated against. It was a piece of very smart diplomacy.
That is smart. We essentially ensured we wouldn't be the only ones paying. What about other NTBs? Like SPS measures?
Sanitary and phytosanitary measures remain a significant challenge, and the FTA does not completely solve this. The EU has incredibly strict, some would say notoriously strict, standards on chemical residues and pesticides in food products.
So our agri-exports could still be blocked?
They could. Even with a zero tariff, if our consignment of mangoes or chilies has pesticide traces above the permitted limits, the entire shipment will be rejected at the border. This is why I always say, a trade deal opens the door, but quality is what allows you to walk through it. The burden is now on Indian farmers, processors, and our export inspection councils to meet these very high standards.
Another area of concern I have is regarding intellectual property, the TRIPS Plus provisions. Civil society organizations always raise alarms about these, saying they could drive up medicine prices.
A very valid and important concern. The EU pushed very hard for something called data exclusivity. This is a TRIPS Plus measure.
Meaning it goes beyond the standard WTO TRIPS agreement?
Yes. In essence, it would have delayed the entry of our generic medicines by preventing our drug regulators from relying on the clinical trial data of the original innovator drug.
Which would mean extending the monopoly period for big pharmaceutical companies and keeping prices high.
Exactly. However, the outcome here is a victory for India. I want to be clear on this. We successfully resisted the most damaging clauses. We protected our generic drug industry, often called the pharmacy of the developing world, and we protected our public health interests. We did not cave on the core issues of data exclusivity that would have hurt the common man's access to affordable medicine.
That's a huge win. Finally, sir, there's the practical issue of implementation lag.
Yes, a practical point, but an important one. The deal is signed in early 2026. But we must remember, the EU is a union of 27 sovereign states. The agreement needs to be ratified by the European Parliament and, depending on its final legal classification, potentially by the parliaments of all 27 member states.
That could take a while.
It could. Realistically, we are looking at a lag of at least 6 months to a year before the tariff cuts actually appear at the customs check. It's not an instant switch.
Sir, this has been an incredibly comprehensive breakdown. For the benefit of all the students watching, could you perhaps summarize the high yield points? What are the key facts they should absolutely memorize for prelims? And what are the broad analytical themes for mains?
Certainly. Let's do a rapid recap for your notes.
Perfect.
For prelims, first, the tagline. Mother of all deals refers to the India-EU FTA. Second, the context. Announced at the Republic Day Parade 2026. Third, geography. The EU has 27 member states. Know your map. Your top trade partners are Germany, Netherlands, Italy. Be prepared for a map-based question like which EU countries do not border the Mediterranean, or identifying the Baltic states.
Good tip.
Fourth, economy. India has a trade surplus with the EU, remember that. It's approximately $25 billion. And fifth, some specifics to remember, 144 service sectors open for India, and the 250,000 vehicle quota, the TRQ, for autos.
Got it. And for mains?
For mains, think in themes. First, strategic autonomy. You must use this deal as a prime example of India diversifying its foreign policy and economic relations, hedging against U.S. protectionism and Chinese aggression.
Okay.
Second, employment and inclusivity. Contrast the impact on labor-intensive sectors like textiles and leather, which will see a huge boost for MSMEs and women's employment, versus the controlled opening in capital-intensive sectors like automobiles. Third, the challenge of NTBs. You must discuss CBAM as the new frontier of green protectionism and how India smartly negotiated the MFN clause to protect itself.
And the last theme.
Fourth, comparison. A good answer will be able to briefly compare this FTA with others, like the India-UK or the India-Australia ECTA agreements. You could mention how the mobility provisions here are far more generous, for instance.
Thank you, sir. That structure helps immensely in organizing our notes and thoughts for an answer. It seems the real work starts now, not for the negotiators, but for the industry itself.
That is the perfect segue to my final point. Before we conclude, I want to leave all of you with a final provocative thought to mull over.
Please.
We have signed the deal. The diplomats have done their job. The tariffs are gone. But the true test, the real challenge, lies in our own domestic industries upgrading their quality.
It's a domestic challenge now.
It is entirely a domestic challenge. We can no longer compete just on being cheap. We have to compete on standards, environmental standards, labor standards, quality standards. If our goods are rejected at the EU border because of pesticide residue or because they have an unacceptably high carbon footprint, then zero tariff means absolutely nothing.
The open door is useless if you can't walk through it.
Precisely. The ball is now firmly in the court of Indian industry to upgrade, to innovate, and to meet the global benchmark. Capacity building at home is just as important as trade negotiation abroad.
That is a very powerful and sobering conclusion, sir.
It is the reality. Students, we hope this deep dive has given you the conceptual clarity that is required not just to pass the exam, but to understand the forces shaping India's future. Do not just memorize the facts. Understand the underlying logic of the negotiations.
And if you found this detailed analysis helpful, and we hope you did, please do support the channel.
Yes, please. Watch till the end for complete conceptual clarity, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Swadharma IA Academy. Do check the description box below for links to our 2027 Foundation Batch and the special Republic Day offers that are currently running. Until next time, keep learning.
Jai Hind.